It is such a pleasure to welcome Rebecca, one of my professors at Oxford, to talk about her book, her meandering career, and an article that really made me rethink sulking, protests, and everything else in between. Welcome to Network Capital, Rebecca. Thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So congratulations, first of all. Your new book is coming out. Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so it's about swearing. It's an underexplored topic in philosophy, so it's a philosophical treatment of it. I'm interested in exploring where swear words get their power to shock us, because they sort of often do. And also exploring the norms around swearing. So I think most of us have the view that we ought not to swear, at least in certain contexts, but sort of exploring what sort of ought are we talking about? You know, is it ever a moral ought, you know, in the sense that we ought not to steal or we ought not to murder people? Or is it something more sort of etiquette related, like, you know, we ought not to swear in the sense that we ought to be polite generally. Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of both. And I was also interested in exploring what we do when we censor swearing. So, you know, if you see swear words in print with the asterisks replacing some of the letters, which is quite common, we all know which word is being used, but somehow that, you know, replacing some of the letters makes it less offensive. So I was interested to explore that as well. So yeah, it's a fun topic.
And Stephen Fry wrote something remarkable about it. How do you know Stephen, and how did you get to read the book? What were his comments like?
I unfortunately don't know him. So my editor at Oxford University Press was thinking about who to ask for some endorsements, and asked me if I had any thoughts. And I said, well, Stephen Fry would be the dream. You know, he's sort of been vocal for a long time about being a fan of swearing. So yeah, my editor got in touch with his people, and he sort of initially agreed to read it without any promise of writing anything. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool already that he's gonna take a look at my work. Yeah, and then he came through with the sort of kind comment. So I was really pleased.
Well, congrats for that. We're going to host you to discuss that book separately. But on Network Capital, our mission is to really democratize how people think about their careers. And you've had a particularly interesting one. Do you want to talk to us a bit about your failures, your failure resume, which I found the most fascinating thing in your website?
Yes, I'm glad you found that. Yes, so I've got a section of my website devoted to my lowlights, which was inspired by the philosopher Ray Langton. And I saw that she'd written that on her website, and I thought, well, this is really important, because I think especially for people who are trying to get a job in academia, or you know, trying to succeed in general, they only see people's successes. You know, they're sort of comparing themselves to people who have made it in some sense, and maybe sort of feeling like a failure themselves, you know, because we compare our insides to other people's outsides, as the saying sometimes goes. So it was really a way of just trying to make it more visible, you know, how much people have to go through rejection and setbacks before they see any sort of success, really. So yeah, and I've had quite a few. In fact, that the website where I put that list of my failures is quite out of date. I haven't updated it for a while, so I've probably got a few more to add when I finally get around to it.
But it's so cool that you do it. And the more I read philosophy, the more I realize how much it has commonalities with entrepreneurship and venture capital. So the new hot thing in the VC world and the entrepreneurship world is to talk more openly about failures. And a lot of entrepreneurs have now started doing the same, because there's pressure to almost appear perfect and appear as somebody who's figured everything out. So I found your failure resume and that of a leading venture capitalist to be very similar. In fact, even career choices are similar. From sometimes not getting the grades that you wanted, sometimes not having to take up a university because of lack of funding, but sort of being entrepreneurial about your career. That's something that I found really remarkable. Do you want to walk us through some of the more challenging moments in your academic career, especially ones that perhaps left you disillusioned, and what made you come back?
Mm, yeah, yeah, that's a great way to frame it. I think I suppose one thing that comes to mind, which has occurred to me sort of several times over the course of my life, is I think we are often encouraged to think of our lives as a sort of trajectory of just climbing to ever higher successes, which makes it really hard if that's not the way it works. You know, if it's not just a process of improving on what you've done before. I think it can be hard if you find yourself, you know, as I did in my 30s, sort of with nothing and sort of looking around you and thinking, oh my God, what a failure. All these people that I know are just sort of happily continuing on with their lives and enjoying more and more success. And yet here I am, I've sort of taken 10 steps back for, you know, the 5 I've taken forward in my life. So I think this is important, and I'm glad to hear you say that, that you think this is sort of becoming more of a thing in business as well, just sort of being open about failures, because I think it's something that's, you know, of course, if you're somebody looking for a secure job, you can't really afford to do this. You need to put your best foot forward. So I think it's up to people who have more secure positions to be open and transparent and sort of, you know, show what their story has looked like. So yeah, I in a sense have a fairly linear career as a philosopher. I left school and immediately went to study philosophy, and that's what I've been doing since, in you know, in the academic sense. But it's been broken up a few times. So initially I wasn't sure I was going to get into university because I didn't get the grades that I was supposed to get. But that was kind of a minor setback. That was sort of a couple of days of worry, and then, you know, it was all fine. They let me in. So yes, I did my undergraduate degree at Leeds and then a master's there in philosophy. And then I was planning to go to Oxford to do a DPhil, well, to do the BPhil and then the DPhil. That's what they require. So the BPhil is their version of the master's, and then you would go on to do the DPhil, the doctorate. But I didn't get funding. So I had applied for, you know, this is a sort of common path for people wanting to do a PhD, apply to a funding organization to provide payment for the fees and also, you know, money to live on. I couldn't, there was no way I could afford to do that myself. So yes, I didn't get it. And I think that was like the first really major setback as I saw it. You know, I'd sort of gone through my time at Leeds, you know, getting good marks, good feedback and so on, and sort of thinking, I'm pretty good at this. And then, you know, sort of get brought down to earth when I realized things weren't going to continue the way I'd hoped. So yeah, I spent a year just sort of doing odd jobs around the university, you know, sort of things like a few weeks at a time getting paid to help various staff members sort out their paperwork, because it was literally paperwork in those days. Invigilating exams, this sort of thing, and then had to reapply to do the PhD because I really wanted to do it, and sort of sat down and thought like an adult about it, which I don't think I'd done the first time round. So I changed the focus of what I wanted to research, and because of that, I ended up applying to Cambridge rather than Oxford. And this time I got the funding, so hooray. But I also hadn't read the terms of my funding properly. So the maximum amount they would give you in those days is 4 years of funding. So that was sort of 1 year to do the master's, which you had to do in order to be allowed to continue to do the PhD, and then 3 years for the PhD. And I'd already used a year of that for my master's at Leeds. So when I went to Cambridge, I only had 3 years left. and they wanted me to do their masters. So they sort of required, they were sort of, you know, doesn't matter if you've got a master's from anywhere else, you have to do our one. So I did that. That used up another year of funding. And so I had 2 years of funding left to do my PhD, and stupidly changed the topic. So what I should have done is just continued to work on what I'd been working on for my master's there, but I didn't. I completely changed the topic just through, I think, boredom, and also just this failure to realize that, of course, I was going to be bored after a year of working quite stressfully on a particular topic. I wanted, you know, the honeymoon period that comes from diving into a new area of research and, you know, sort of having fun with it. So I ended up sort of embarking on a new topic, having to do the PhD in 2 years, which was a really stressed, rushed experience.
Not a breeze for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's I think it, so my PhD thesis certainly could have done with an extra year of work on it, but I did pass it, thankfully, because by the time it was examined, I was working full time. I couldn't really have afforded to spend much more time on it. Yeah, but due to how stressful that was, I fell out of love with academia a little bit. You know, the initial plan had been to do the PhD and then get an academic job, which wasn't a particularly well thought out plan. It was, you know, as I've come to realize, this is a way that a lot of academics start on academic careers. You know, they don't sort of early on make a conscious decision to do that. They just sort of keep doing the next thing and then the next thing, and they just sort of get funneled into this sort of academic production line and sort of, hey, I'm an academic. And that's sort of what was happening with me. But I decided I would dump that and get a job in something completely different. So I think I was, again, chasing this sort of honeymoon feeling of starting something new and not having made any mistakes yet. So I went and worked in IT. I worked at IBM for a few years and really hated it. And I don't think
tell us, I mean, that has to be something, a philosopher in IT. That has to be something.
I'm not sure they really knew what to do with me, because I just entered in the sort of graduate scheme, and I just wasn't in any respect, you know, computery or sort of good at IT or anything like that. And I just really wasn't very suited for, you know, sort of corporate environment. I've never really worked as part of a team. I work alone, you know, that's just sort of, I've come to realize it's very antisocial these days to sort of say that you are, you know, you're somebody who sort of works best in solitude. But I think that's basically me.
Even today?
Sorry?
Even today?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy connecting with people and discussing ideas, but ultimately I work best if it's on my own projects. You know, sort of if it's an article I'm writing on my own or a book I'm writing on my own. I don't really sort of thrive very well in team environments.
Yeah.
Which is not because I hate people. You know, I really enjoy sort of discussing with people. I just don't have that muscle that helps me thrive in sort of teamwork environments. And whereas, you know, that was sort of very much the way it was set up when I was at IBM. Yeah,
I used to work at Microsoft. Like, without teamwork, it can get really tricky.
Right. Yes. I mean, I could see that. And yeah, it was quite hard. I mean, I'm sure that some of the coders and the sort of more technical people probably spend a bit of time working alone, but unfortunately I just wasn't qualified to do that sort of thing. But yeah, so I was a bit of a square peg in a round hole, and I stayed there for a few years until they offered a voluntary redundancy scheme. And then I sort of thought, well, I want to leave. I'd sort of realized really early on that this wasn't for me. So I thought, well, I may as well leave while they're offering to pay me for leaving.
Right. Makes sense.
So yeah, and sort of, I suppose one positive thing that came out of that whole time is I'd really thought hard about what I wanted to do, which direction I wanted my career to go in. And I think it really did serve me well. I think one thing that academics don't realize, if they've only worked in academia, is that lots of people don't like their jobs. They do the job because they're paid to do it, and then they go home and they sort of, whatever they find fulfilling or enjoyable, they do, off the clock in their own time. Yeah. But academics, although we do lots of things that we don't enjoy, we still spend large amounts of time of our professional lives doing what we're interested in, researching what we're interested in doing. And that's an immense privilege, I think. But it's something I hadn't really connected with until I was working in a different environment. So yeah, I left IBM, and I spent a sort of 9 months, I think, unemployed, applying for jobs, and just, sort of spending the whole time basically kind of working in a kind of 9-to-5 way, but without being paid, but just sort of working on brushing up my academic CV, because I had this sort of gap in my academic career. So sort of publishing articles, writing, doing things that I thought would make me look good. And yeah, eventually I got my break. I got a postdoc position at Oxford. So yeah, that's where I ended up next. I was working in the Future of Humanity Institute, which is Nick Bostrom's research institute in Oxford. I think I was their first employee. It's quite big now.
So did you work with Nick often on projects?
Yeah, so it was just me and him at first. And then, it grew sort of while I was still there. But yeah, I got what I wanted. I spent a lot of time feeling, oh God, I've really slipped through the net. I've missed my chance. That's it for me. I'm on a scrap heap. And then I was back in academia, and I sort of couldn't believe my luck. But it also, that had a sting in the tail, because I had writer's block, like really awful writer's block for months. I sort of just started out with this sense of, oh God, they've really made a mistake employing me. I need to write something interesting to, to prove to them that I was a good choice. And that just had the effect of, I literally had no ideas. I couldn't think of what to write about. And I think, in retrospect, it was just sort of massive anxiety that I was sort of really putting pressure on myself. But for a long time, I just couldn't think of a single interesting thought. So that made it worse, sort of then I was even more of a terrible choice. And yeah, over time, I think that eased. And actually, having said that I work best alone, that was probably eased by writing, working on things with other people. So sort of co-authoring papers with other people, and sort of because it made a big difference just having other people say, oh, that's an interesting thought, Rebecca, or I like what you're thinking about here, just getting a bit of positive feedback. So yeah, that was my first academic break professionally.
You made it, right? Like after many ups and downs, somewhat
unorthodox
path. Yeah.
Temporarily. Yeah, for a moment I made it. Yeah, a hugely positive thing there, I think, was that it was what I was researching while I was there, which was it's quite a range of things they work on, but I was working on the ethics of human enhancement, which was a real departure from what I'd written my PhD on. I hadn't really written in ethics before. And that was, I think, a massive blessing. And I'm really grateful that things turned out that way, because I think, because I'm sort of, have a tendency to be a bit lazy. I think what I might have done if I just had free reign to work on whatever I like is just to sort of continue with the momentum I'd started with my PhD, you know, sort of explore various angles of what came out of that. You know, sort of anyone who writes a PhD knows that you end up with more unanswered questions in a way than answered ones. So there was plenty of scope to sort of continue in that vein, but that wasn't what I was being paid to do. So I had to sort of get into another area, which was great. You know, I sort of ended up just sort of, I don't even think I'd be working on the stuff I'm working on now if I hadn't had that push to, you know, sort of work on new things. So yeah, I was there for 3 years, and I left when I was pregnant with my first child. And then I left when I had maternity leave, and sort of my contract was at an end anyway. So I ended up out of academia and having another child eventually. And that was, you know, this was a really difficult period. It was the sort of, the relationship I was in broke down. It was an abusive situation. And I sort of ended up in this situation thinking I'm living kind of in poverty with my children, and nobody's coming to rescue me. You know, the only way that we're going to get out of this situation is if I get us out. And then just sort of looking around myself and thinking, oh God, I've got 2 children under the age of 2. How's anyone supposed to even get dressed, let alone, you know, sort of work up their academic CV? But, you know, there was a period of basically spending every waking moment working on philosophy, you know, sort of, again, sort of like I'd done before, trying to sort of show that I was active as a researcher, that some of the contacts I'd made at Oxford really helped me out. You know, I ended up getting eventually another postdoc position in a different institute. It wasn't the Future of Humanity Institute. It was the Oxford Centre for Neuroethics, which is part of the UHERO Centre. So yeah, I went back to Oxford. Different environment because, you know, I'd had children and I was in this kind of situation where I was still with their father at that point, but it wasn't the sort of ideal situation. And then after about a year of being there, I got the job that I've got now at Royal Holloway, which was basically a permanent job. So it was a bit more security for me because, you know, I was the only earner. So yeah, and there I still am. You know, that the relationship I was in ended, and it's just me and my children. We're still living in Oxfordshire, and I'm still at Royal Holloway, but that's kind of basically it there. There's been no more sort of serious plot twists in my career since then.
But thank you for sharing this. I know, you know, it takes a lot of courage to talk about it on such a public platform. And thank you for being so resilient. I think your children are blessed to have you as a parent who's gone through so many ups and downs, and with such grace. So thanks again, Rebecca. We really appreciate this. I'm sure people, not just academics listening to it, will take a lot of inspiration from the hustle that you've gone through.
Yeah, hustle is a good word for it.
Did you sulk during this torturous period?
Yeah, I've been asked this a lot since I started working on sulking, which is only fairly recently, really. So I certainly sulked in that relationship and the ones that I had previous to that. And I think, you know, sort of it's gone hand in hand with sort of various unhealthy dynamics in relationships, you know, not ones that I'd want to repeat. So yeah, I think, you know, I think what often happens is that people who aren't generally sulky sometimes sulk in their romantic relationships, which was a case with me. You have these sort of norms that we obey in our interactions with others, but then we sort of have our intimate relationships with our romantic partners and sometimes with other family members as well. And it's like there's different rules apply. There's sort of some topics that people just won't discuss with their partners, or they don't approach issues in a certain way because that's just not how things have done. So yeah, I think I was a bit of a sulker. There was a bit of a dynamic of me being a kind of a dependent partner. So in some ways I was kind of pushed into that position, but sort of someone who wasn't really making the big decisions, and so sulking was something that I would do. Sort of
I'm going to be asking you a whole bunch of questions about sulking because I found your lectures so fascinating. But let's start with the fundamentals. What is sulking, and why should we care?
Yeah, okay. Excuse me, I've got a cold drink and a hot drink here. So, I can never give up my tea, even when it's roasting hot outside. So I think sulking is, I suppose the most obvious description of it is that it's a form of withdrawal. I think that's what springs to mind for most of us when we think of sulking. We think of somebody refusing to speak or refusing to engage in their usual way. But of course, we can withdraw without sulking. Sometimes we might just want some time alone, or we might want a nap, or some. There's all sorts of reasons why you might want to withdraw from interaction with other people without sulking. So then the question is, well, what is it about sulking that turns withdrawal? What's special about sulking? So it involves withdrawal, but what else does it need to involve? And I think there's a couple of things. I think one is that there's a directedness about it. So we sulk, there's a target of a sulk. There's somebody we're sulking at or to or with. So typically somebody that we're upset with. So we sulk when we're upset about something. And the withdrawal is intended to be inconvenient for that person. So we sulk with people who want to engage with us. So typically people that we're close to, people that want us to talk to them and who are going to be stressed by our refusal to talk to them. So we want to punish them in some way. We need it to be inconvenient for them. So I think that's part of it. It's withdrawal, but there's this element of punishment that's directed at another person. And I think there's also a communicative aspect of it, which might sound strange because one of the features of sulking is that it's a withdrawal of communication. But although it's a withdrawal of verbal communication or normal communication, whatever normal is in the relationship in question, the withdrawal itself is a type of communication, I think. So, if you have somebody close to you who's sulking with you, although they're not talking to you, there's something that they're communicating to you via their act of withdrawal. So, you immediately know that they're upset with you, that perhaps you need to do something to bring this withdrawal to an end. And I think that part of it is a really rich aspect to it. There's all sorts of things that we can communicate wordlessly. And there's also lots that we can't communicate wordlessly. I think we're often frustrated with people who sulk because we kind of want to know what the problem is, and if they just tell us, then we could solve it quickly rather than spend hours trying to guess what the issue is. So there's lots that's not communicated, but then there's a lot that is communicated just by somebody's refusing to speak to you. So that's the essence of sulking. I think it's withdrawal with a sort of punishment element aimed at a particular person, and this element of communication, wordless communication. And I think, if you were to express in words what that wordless communication is saying, it would be something like, I'm angry with you and I need you to put this problem right. This problem that I'm not going to tell you about, but you need to guess what the problem is and then you need to put it right. So that's kind of what's being communicated in the sulk.
Would you say that your interest in the subject arose from your work in philosophy, or how did you come to pay attention to this very
Mm.
interesting phenomenon?
Yeah, so it actually arose through the work that I was doing on swearing. So obviously, it's often the case when we swear, we are communicating inappropriately. There's plenty of times when you can swear and it's not inappropriate, but a lot of the time it's rude. So we're communicating something offensive to another person, which breaks all sorts of norms. So, the norms of politeness usually, but in some cases it might break. If you're swearing on live TV, then you're also going to be breaking broadcasting rules as well. So that, there's sort of various rules that you could be breaking. And for that reason, sometimes we don't swear even when we feel like it. We hold our tongues because we don't want to be seen to be breaking the rules. But I think at other times we do want to communicate what's offensive, but we still don't want to break the rules. And so we get clever about how we communicate this inappropriate thing. And some of that can involve things like, what I described right at the beginning. So when swear words are represented in news stories, for example, with asterisks replacing some of the letters, that's a way of communicating an offensive word in, provided that certain conditions are met, an inoffensive manner.
Right.
But I think that we do that in lots of more complicated ways as well. And I think sulking falls under this umbrella. That by sulking, we communicate something that, were we to say it explicitly, we might be challenged about it. So perhaps you're sulking because your partner can't see you at the weekend, even though they have a very good reason. Let's say they've had this commitment for months, and it's a sort of perfectly respectable commitment. They're not neglecting you, but still you're upset about it, and so you sulk about it. I mean, if you were to communicate your resentment explicitly, you would have to say something like, I want us to spend time together at the weekend, but you're going away, you're doing this other thing instead. And if you were to say that explicitly, then your partner might reasonably say, well, we can spend time together next weekend. You've known for a long time about this commitment. I'm not doing anything wrong by doing whatever it is, and so on. So, if we were to communicate explicitly what we communicate wordlessly with sulking, we might be challenged about it. So I think when we sulk, we do that. Well, one reason we might sulk is in order to get around that we worry about being challenged about what we're feeling angry or resentful about. So we just sulk about it. So if we're not expressing it, we can't be challenged. And I think there's other behaviors that fall in this category as well. So things like passive aggression, when we sort of convey anger to people in a way that's deniable. So, sort of by using ambiguous behavior. And also, sort of looking on a more sort of happy,
silent treatment.
The silent treatment, exactly. But, these are all quite negative behaviors. And I think we're not always limited to negative behaviors in this respect. So sometimes there might be positive reasons why we might want to not be explicit and direct. So that could just be for politeness. So we might, if somebody asks us, what do you think of this outfit I'm wearing, and we don't think it's very flattering, then it would be very rude to say, you look awful. But maybe instead we might say, well, what about that thing you wore the other day? That looked great. Or, something along these lines. So the person we're talking to kind of gets the message that we don't like what they're wearing, but we've done that indirectly and without explicitly saying really sort of directly what we think. So I think that's a way of saying, conveying content which could be offensive in an indirect and therefore more benign way. So, I don't think this general dynamic of saying in an ambiguous and indirect way something that we don't want to say directly is necessarily objectionable in general. But I think in sulking it often is objectionable.
Yeah. It's fascinating. My mum is a literature professor at the university in Delhi, and one of her poems talks about women and linguistic aspects of sulking. So in Hindi, a version is called root jana, and she was basically connecting with Roos jana and how women sort of travel in their minds, and she was connecting with Russia, which is also called Rus, nothing to do with the contemporary politics going on. But try to connect the dots for me. But what does gender and sulking, if at all, have to do with each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I found this quotation from the Scottish philosopher David Hume while I was looking into sulking. And I'd seen it before. It's quite a famous quotation, but my interest in sulking caused me to view it in a new light, where he says something along the lines of, in society, men have more power than women, but women can use their charms and insinuation to get their own way. So, women don't have the power to make big decisions themselves, basically, but they can influence men in various ways to get what they want, to get the men to pull the levers of power in the way that the women want. And I think that captures a really important dynamic here. So he's saying, for somebody who lacks the power to get their own needs met, they can employ various strategies to have manipulate other people into meeting their needs. And that might apply to various groups. There's sort of all sorts of disenfranchised groups in society, not just women. But so for anyone who lacks the power to just, make big decisions about how their own life goes, they might be able to kind of use more subtle means to have their needs met. So I think, to sort of address your question about gender, I mean, there is this sort of long history of sort of women not having the political power that men have, either through their sort of representation in politics or just not being allowed to vote, but in more domestic settings as well. So, sort of historically, the husband has been the breadwinner. And I mean, I'm talking sort of UK, US context here. I did sort of more globally, I'm sure that there's sort of different dynamics at play. But, in settings where one party has less power than the other, then the person with less power is likely to find methods like sulking more useful. So that could have emerged as sort of sulking being something that we associate with women because they just haven't had more overt means at their disposal for getting their needs met.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think these dynamics of power for the longest time have been true in most parts of the world, if not all. And I think your work, draws attention to that. And, again, like just back to the language, it'll be interesting to see what does sulking mean in different languages. Hindi, I know, English, I know, but it'll be interesting to see. Perhaps we can, do some sort of a study on it. But sulking has been relevant from pages in history to contemporary politics. Do you want to tell our listeners a bit about why they should care from the historical lens to why they should care about sulking from what we see on television in the political theater?
Well, I suppose, sulking gets a bad rap. And this was certainly the view that I initially came to it with, where we think of sulking as sort of childish. Obviously sort of children sulk because they don't, sort of often because they just don't have the ability to get their needs met. But
I sulk as well. I think of myself as sort of child.
Yeah, I think, when we encounter adult sulking, there is, we sort of often have this view, this sort of, oh gosh, how undignified of you. Surely you should be able to employ some other means to get what you need. But I think that there's various reasons why someone might sulk. We've talked about the, the sort of the power that might be at play here. So if you don't have power, then you might have to be creative with the means you employ to get what you like, which is, that's sort of largely a political issue. But I think also there's a range of other reasons. So it might be that somebody has the power to meet their own needs, but for one reason or another is worried that they will be, if they were to express their needs explicitly, they might be rejected or invalidated. So this is something that is discussed in one of the very few articles about sulking, academic articles about sulking that I encountered. So an article by a psychotherapist called Catriona Wrottesley called Sulking as a Declaration of Dependence. She talks about people perhaps sulking because they're afraid of invalidation. So, sort of basically saying, this is what I need from you. And I guess being laughed at or being sort of told that you're unworthy of having your needs met and so on. And I think, that certainly makes sense, I think, at the level of personal relationships, sort of there's all sorts of ways, like, people in family relationships or romantic relationships might have the experience that their needs and feelings are not recognized in important ways. But I think also politically, there's just throughout history, there has been sort of many examples of people, sort of certain groups not having their needs appreciated and met, and perhaps the services and resources that society provides being structured around a particular type of person with a particular type of background and a particular set of needs. So I guess an obvious example that springs to mind is, the sort of heteronormative conception of the family that has kind of really been dominant. And, only recently, I suppose, in the past decade or so, we've seen that being challenged and, sort of progress being made for people to sort of marry in sort of non-heterosexual partnerships and so on. But that might be a case where, the needs of our political framework recognizes that sort of heterosexual couples and their families have particular needs. And that might be something that's recognized through just sort of very practical things like education, taxation, and so on. But then the needs of sort of other less conventional partnerships and family setups is not recognized. And, this sort of lack of recognition of one's needs, I think, that this is what Catriona Wrottesley was talking about, sort of that might be something that leads us to sulk. So we're just afraid of even expressing our needs if we anticipate that they're going to be rejected. So in a way, it's a form of silencing, I think. And then one response to that silencing might be to sulk, which is a way of trying to get our needs met silently, in a way, I guess.
I think we briefly discussed this in class, but do you think Gandhi was a sulker?
I was fascinated by this, by your comment about this. I don't know. So I don't feel like I know enough about this situation. I know that there was somebody in the class who was sort of disagreeing with your perspective there. So yeah, I'm looking forward to digging into this. So sort of sulking and similar methods of communication I have as my plan for my next book. So I'm definitely going to dig into this.
But you do, I mean, in your article, which was fascinating, you do talk about the Iliad, even powerful American presidents sulking in different ways. Do you want to tell our listeners about that?
Yes. So when I was first thinking about this topic, I wanted to find some sort of high-profile examples of sulking. Because I think that makes it relatable, and we all have our personal experience of the sulking in our own relationships, I guess, whether that's as the sulker or the target of a sulk. But having examples that we can all relate to, I think, can be really beneficial as a bit of a discussion starter. So I was looking around at where we might find some high-profile sulkers. And this is a really interesting exercise, because I think if you are looking around at sort of, sulkers who have made the news or sulkers in literature, you are kind of by definition looking at sulkers who are sort of interesting and high profile in some way, which kind of really, I think, brings into focus this concern I expressed about how we think it's somehow undignified to sulk. So I think this comes out in, you mentioned the Iliad. I mean, this is a sort of really famous example of sulking where, I mean, it's right at the start of the Iliad. So if anyone wants to kind of explore this, you don't have to read very far. So, so Achilles, who is the star fighter of the Greeks, wins a woman as a trophy, as you kind of did in those days, I guess. And he has his woman confiscated by Agamemnon, the Greek king. And Achilles is annoyed about this, and they have this kind of little bickering match where Achilles says that he's going home if Agamemnon, pulls rank in this way and steals his woman. And Agamemnon says, "Oh, well, fine, go home then." It's sort of really very domestic, the way that people might bicker in a relationship. So Agamemnon goes ahead and confiscates Achilles' woman, and Achilles goes off to sulk in his tent. So it's become this saying, to go off and sulk in one's tent. So basically, yes, Achilles withdraws from fighting. So, I mentioned earlier on that sulking involves some sort of withdrawal. And, in sort of mundane settings, that's often just refusing to speak. But Achilles had more power at his disposal. He was the best fighter. So his withdrawal was not merely the silent treatment, it was his withdrawal from fighting, which had the consequence that the Greeks started losing in the Trojan War. So there was this element, there was this withdrawal. There was also the sort of element of punishment that I mentioned before. So Achilles was sulking at Agamemnon. And so his sulk had to involve punishing Agamemnon in a certain way. So, what better way than causing his entire nation to start losing in the war they were fighting. And it was very clear why he was sulking. There was this sort of, the communicative element was present as well. And eventually later on, Agamemnon returns Briseis, the woman that he'd confiscated from Achilles. So, he tries to put things right. He tries to bring the sulk to an end. But by that time, it was too late. Achilles was refusing to be placated. And eventually Achilles does stop sulking, but only when his best friend stroke lover, depending on who you read about this, is killed in the war. So this is an example of, sort of somebody who's really quite an upstanding, powerful person, nevertheless resorts to a sulk in order to try and get what he wants and make his feelings clear. And I suppose we also get an insight here into sort of how subtle the power dynamics can be, because in one sense, Achilles was powerful, right? He was he was a top fighter. He wasn't sort of a weak, oppressed person. But he lacked power in this particular way. So, sort of relative to Achilles, he lacked power. So I suppose we could make a case for Achilles being a little bit, sort of resorting to sulking from a perspective of powerlessness. And you also mentioned the sort of example from politics. So this was a sort of more recent case. Donald Trump's reaction to losing his election to Joe Biden. So this was, of course, at the height of the COVID pandemic. And Trump's response to losing was to start sort of spouting conspiracy theories about electoral fraud and all the rest of it. And he just withdrew from public life. There's sort of, it's interesting to look at the journalistic response to this, sort of plenty of journalists accusing him of retreating from his duties and sulking. So it really is a classic case of a sulk. He was annoyed, he lost, and he responded to that by withdrawing. And again, he's not merely giving somebody the silent treatment, he's in a position of immense power. So his withdrawal is sort of basically, I'm going to leave you all to fend for yourselves at this time when there's this sort of infection raging through the country. People really need leadership, but I'm not going to provide it. And of course, it had this communicative element. He was sort of spouting these conspiracy theories, which of course turned out to be baseless, sort of making very clear why it was that he was upset. And I think that case is particularly interesting because it illustrates that you can sulk even if you don't have any reason to sulk. You know, sort of after, I suppose so far we've talked about people sulking in order to get their needs met, or sulking when they have reason for resentment or reason to be to object to something. But Trump simply lost the election and didn't like it. So he was a sore loser. He hadn't been wronged. He lost fair and square, but you know, that didn't stop him sulking about it.
When you wrote this essay and when you started, you know, this body of work, what did you really hope to accomplish? Like, what did success look like for you?
Yeah, so as I said, I'm wanting to do a sort of book length exploration of sulking and kind of similar behaviors, but I don't have a fantastic attention span. I have an ADHD diagnosis. So I think, so I contacted Aon, which is where the article was published, and offered them an article basically so that somebody would give me a word limit and a deadline, and I could write something shorter. So, you know, I can't remember the exact word limit they gave me. But the initial conception of what success would look like here was kind of getting the basic ideas down and presenting it to people to read so that I could have a discussion with people, you know, kind of as we're doing now. It's interesting to talk to people about it, and people have sort of got thrown up all sorts of different perspectives. So that's, you know, a great benefit of writing, you know, writing a shorter article. And I think I'm raising as many questions as I'm answering. So I mentioned at the end of the article that the ethics here remains to be explored. So I think in some cases sulking is, maybe I'd say it's always frustrating to be the target of assault, but often it's fairly benign. You know, it's annoying, and maybe we would prefer people to approach airing their grievances in a more direct way, but you know, we maybe wouldn't want to say that somebody who sulks is necessarily doing anything morally wrong. It's just a bit annoying. But I think in some cases it is morally objectionable. So I think Trump's case comes close to that, but, you know, for consequentialist reasons at least. You know, he was people died as a result of his stepping back from his leadership duties. But there's also cases where, this is another thing that's talked about by Katrina Wrottesley in her article, that sulking can be used as a tool of abuse. So in abusive relationships, people, and she mentions sort of potentially romantic partners or a parent, might not be the powerless person in the relationship. You know, they might be the person who gets to make all the big decisions, but they might sulk just in order to terrorize the person they're sulking with. So to keep that person on the back foot and feeling like they've done something wrong, and just, you know, sort of so that they can't relax. So they're using it just as a tool to terrorize somebody else. So I think in that case, that's ethically objectionable. But I'm not sure exactly yet where the dividing line lies. You know, what is it that turns a benign sulk into something that is objectionable? Right. And I think a lot of the
bit like envy, malignant envy, benign envy.
Yes, I think envy is another fascinating topic. Yeah,
I'll send you this essay I wrote on this, on in praise of envy.
Right. Okay. Yeah, there's a philosopher, Sarah Pratasi, who works on this, and sort of makes a case for using it as a positive force. But yes, and it's also something that can be very destructive. Somebody said, I can't remember who said, envy is the only one of the 7 deadly sins that isn't fun.
That isn't fun. Yes.
Yeah. But yes, I think there's ground to explore here, which I'm looking forward to doing. But I think the answer to that question, when is a sulk benign, isn't in any of the obvious places that we'd look. So I think often if you ask people why they find sulking objectionable, assuming that they do, I think most people do, or at least find it objectionable when they're the target, they'll often say things like, it's the person who's sulking should just say what the matter is. They should do it. They should be open and transparent about what they want. But I think that there's, as I said earlier on, there's plenty of cases where not being open and transparent can be desirable, right? Whether through politeness or, or tact. There's all sorts of reasons why it might be important and even a good thing to be ambiguous in our communication. And then I think also sometimes people say sulking is manipulative, which it is. You're sort of typically trying to get the person you're sulking at to do something, to solve some problem. But I think sometimes that's objectionable, but certainly not all the time. I mean, certainly not in the case of the powerless sulkers that we were talking about earlier, who might be sulking because they can't get their needs
really
met any other way.
Talk back at another person more in a position of power. Sometimes people in tech, they're just sulking just to get themselves warmed up. It's just a matter of chatter before stuff gets done. So again, your article raises a lot of really interesting questions around it. Interestingly, I did not stumble on this article through the course readings. It was one of the most popular articles on a particular day, and somebody sent it to me. So I was actually pleasantly surprised to find it as part of the course reading. So this was that's why it added up, quite wonderfully. So on, I think, 12th or 15th of May, this company that selects the top 5 articles of the day sent it. I read it, and then it was part of the course. So clearly, this has a mass appeal because people relate to, sulking just the way they relate to envy in so many different ways. I think it'll be fun as you explore it in the form of a book. I was wondering, is there anything that I should have asked you about sulking or your career or your body of work that I didn't, or any parting words that you'd like to share?
I think we covered a lot. I think there's a lot to dig into here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I thoroughly enjoyed, of course, your class, your writing, and this particular podcast. And I look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you. This has been really great. Thanks for having me.